All right, welcome back to our study in the book of Acts. Today we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 7, Stephen's defense. Last time we looked at how Stephen was arrested. Stephen was one of the men who was selected by the apostle, by the church in order to help the apostles with the widows, because there arose a dispute between the Hellenistic Jew women and the Hebraic Jewish women. And the dispute was there was favoritism being shown toward the Hebraic Jewish women, and the because the widows, the Hellenistic widows, were not being looked tended to daily as much as the other women were. So the apostles said, "We need help. We can't do this. We need you guys to help us." So you, the called out assembly, the believers, you help us pick 7 men, and one of those men was Stephen. And so Stephen was performing great powers and wonders because the Holy Spirit was great in him. He was full of grace and power. And it got some people upset. The people of the free synagogue of the freedmen, the Cyrenians, Alexandrians, Cilicians, and Asians rose up against Stephen. But Stephen was unable, but they were unable to withstand the knowledge and wisdom of Stephen and spirit. And so they had to uh, round up some false accusers. They probably paid them off. I believe they probably paid them off and to bring up blasphemy charges. So let's get started. We're going to read. Um, I'm just going to start with verse 1, and then we're just going to keep on going until verse 16. So, verse 1, the high priest said, according to Stephen, "Are these things so?" Okay, or what things so? So, in order to answer that question, are these things so, we got to establish what exactly are the high priest speaking of? What is Stephen going to have to address? So, in order to do that, let's go back to the previous chapter and look at verses 13 through 14. They put forward false witnesses who have said, "We've heard him say that this Jesus, the Nazarene, will destroy this place and alter the custom which Moses handed down to us." So the false charges are the basis of what they have accused uh, Stephen with. Stephen knows he knows he's not going to be able to defend this. They've got people saying that he's speaking blasphemous, and he's speaking that the temple's going to be destroyed, and their religious system's going to be destroyed, and they're preaching this in the name of Jesus the Nazarene. And they're preaching the resurrection, and they're preaching the only way to be saved is through Jesus, and the Jews have had enough. So the high priests are questioning Stephen, and Stephen, full of wisdom, the Spirit, he knows he's not going to be able to get out of this one. So he's going to give a defense. It's not an ordinary defense. Uh, they want to kill Stephen, and he realizes this. He then begins his lengthy defense, which is nothing more than a brilliant dialogue of how Jesus the Nazarene is the fulfillment of scriptures. When his dialogue is completed, the religious leaders become even more enraged with him. And we'll talk about that later. So let's look at verses 2 through 4, chapter 7. And he said, Stephen, "Hear me, brethren and fathers. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran, and said to him, 'Leave your country and your relatives and come into the land that I will show you.' Then he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. From there, after his father died, God had moved him to this country in which you are living now. You are now living." Stephen begins with the calling of Abraham. This would uh, pique their attention because they esteem Abraham as the beginner of their religious system. Everything hinges on Abraham. Of course, they believed in Adam and Eve and Moses. They believed in Adam and Eve and Enoch, but everything hinges off of Abraham. He uses the term God of glory, which is also seen in Psalms chapter 29, verse 3. This can also, this situation that Stephen is speaking of, that he describes, that Abraham left his land for the land that God told him, is found in Genesis chapter 11, verses 31 through chapter 12, verse 4. Stephen, unlike those in the Sanhedrin, understood that Jesus the Nazarene was the fulfillment of why Abraham was called to leave his families and his homeland to the land where God would lead him to. Stephen knew, unlike the people and the religious leaders, the Sanhedrin, the 70, the scribes and the Pharisees, even the rabbis, could not accept, could not connect the dots that the scriptures, which they teach, are fulfilled in Jesus. I think they probably suspected that, but didn't want to accept it. And hearing Stephen boldly proclaim Jesus is just sets them off. Abraham was called to leave his family's homeland to the land God would lead him to. Stephen quotes from Genesis 12:1 here. Abraham and his father Terah moved to Haran, and there Terah died. Abraham left Haran after Terah died. So let's look at verse 5. But he gave him no inheritance in it, speaking of Abraham, not even a foot of ground. And yet, even when he had no child, he promised that he would give it to him as a possession and to his descendants after him. So the land that Abraham was supposed to inherit, he hadn't inherited yet. And as he lived, he didn't have a great nation. He had servants and he had sons, and he may have seen some of his grandchildren, but Abraham did not get to see the land, the kingdom, and the descendants, and the promise. But make no mistake, Abraham understood that the promise would be in the coming of God's son, the Messiah. Abraham knew that through his seed, being the descendant, the one singular descendant, all the nations of the world would be blessed. Abraham understood that that descendant would be none other than the Son of God. God promises Abraham that he would give him an inheritance to him and his seed, although Abraham was childless at that time. Stephen understood that this promise will be fulfilled in the coming of Jesus and the seed of Abraham. Let's look at verses 6 and 7. But God spoke to this effect, that his descendants would be aliens in a foreign land, and that they would be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. And whatever nation to which they would belong, they would be in bondage, I myself will judge, said God. And after that, they will come out and will serve me in this place. And this is speaking of how God tells Abraham, your descendants are going to go to a foreign land and they're going to be enslaved there for 400 years. Stephen reminds them how God informed Abraham that his descendants would be enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. Then he states how they would come out of the land and they would serve him in the land of promise. And this can be found in Genesis chapter 15, verses 12 through 14, where God tells Abraham, your descendants are going to be slaves for 400 years in a foreign land. This, of course, was in reference to the family of the 12 sons of Jacob traveling to Egypt and living there as slaves for 400 years. Now let's read verse 8. This is a brilliant defense. He's starting off with Abraham and the patriarchs. He's just getting, and I can see the Pharisees going, oh my goodness, what is he doing? We already know this. Why is he wasting time? You know what we would call that today? They would call that a filibuster in the Congress. But Stephen was doing no filibuster. Stephen was educating these religious leaders. Verse 8, and he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac became the father of Jacob. And Jacob of the 12 patriarchs. Stephen speaks of God giving Abraham the covenant of circumcision and how Abraham became the father of Isaac. And Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob became the father of the 12 patriarchs, 12 tribes. He had 12 sons. So they know all of this. Stephen has established a foundation of his message. This can be seen in Genesis chapter 17, verses 10 through 11, where you see the covenant of circumcision, and Genesis chapter 35, verses 22 through 26, where the sons of Jacob are spelled out. The 12 sons of Jacob are spelled out. And this is not exactly what the religious leaders expect from the defense of Jesus or Stephen. I'm just thinking, we know all this. Stephen, get on with it. Come on. At this point, Stephen's word probably seemed pointless. However, he is weaving a web. He's putting the pieces together. He is piecing together his defense that demonstrates how the scriptures have been fulfilled through the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the Nazarene. Whom they know, Jesus the Nazarene, that's what they call him. And he, Jesus the Nazarene, is indeed the Messiah of the scriptures. That's the ultimate point that Stephen's going to make. But he's got to go all the way back to Abraham, because you see, it all started with Abraham. God made a promise with Abraham. In your seed, all the nations would be blessed. And Abraham answered the promise. Abraham answered the call. He left his land, and he had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob was the father of the 12 patriarchs. Let's read verses 9 through 10. The 12 patriarchs became jealous of Joseph and sold him into Egypt. Yet God was with him and rescued him from all his afflictions and gained him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh, that's Joseph, king of Egypt. And he made him, Joseph, governor over Egypt and all his household. Stephen then speaks of how the 11 brothers, being filled with jealousy, sold Joseph into Egypt. This can be seen in Genesis chapter 37, verses 18 through 36. Stephen then describes how God was with Joseph and how he gave Joseph wisdom, and he allowed Joseph to gain favor with Pharaoh, and to the point that Pharaoh made Joseph the governor in charge of the grain. Whoever wanted to get grain because of the famine, they had to go see Joseph. Joseph was in charge of the storehouse. Stephen and uh, the religious leaders, and this can be seen in Genesis chapter 39 through chapter 41. The religious leaders, they know all this. Stephen, we know. Get on with it. Stephen is still putting the pieces together. He's weaving that story. Let's look at verses 11 through 16. And that's where we're going to start wrapping it up. Now a famine came over all Egypt and Canaan, and great affliction with it. And our fathers could find no food. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent our fathers there the first time. So Jacob, remember the first time Jacob said, sons, go see if you can buy grain from Egypt. And on the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family was disclosed to Pharaoh. So you remember the first time they go there, and it's told to Joseph that these men are here to see him, and Joseph knows these are my brothers. They don't recognize Joseph because Joseph looks like an Egyptian, but Joseph knows who they are. So Joseph told them to go back and bring their other brother, bring Benjamin. So they come back the second time, uh, and Joseph made himself known. Then Joseph sent word and invited Jacob, his father, and all his relatives to come to him. 75 persons in all. That's where it started. So the 75 people in the family of Jacob came to Egypt, and there they stayed for 400 years. And Jacob went down to Egypt, and there he died, and our fathers died. And from there they were removed to Shechem and laid in the tomb which Abraham had purchased for a sum of money, and the sons of Hamor in Shechem. So we're going to start reading there. Let me summarize this, and we'll finish up here. Stephen then gives an account of how Jacob sent his sons to Egypt to get grain, and they go back to their homeland because Joseph said, "Go back and get your brother, bring him with me." And they came back the second time, and it was then when Joseph made himself known to them. And you can read all about that in Genesis chapter 42 through 45. Stephen accounts how Jacob and his entire family came to Egypt, 75 people in all. And that's in Genesis chapter 46. He tells of the death of Jacob and the fathers. In John MacArthur's study Bible, The notes for verse 16 state, and quote, the Old Testament does not record where Joseph's brothers were buried, but Stephen reveals it was in Shechem. And this was probably oral tradition. So Stephen was not only educated in the scriptures, he was educated in the oral tradition. After this came the 400 years of slavery. And this is where we'll stop for this episode. What we know so far is that Stephen is masterful in the scriptures, and he's masterful in the history of the Jewish traditions. And we will continue with how God called Moses to lead the people out of Egypt. And then we'll look at how they lived in the wilderness and how God gave them the tabernacle of testimony in the wilderness, and how Joshua drove out the inhabitants of the land, and how David found favor in God's sight, and how Solomon built a house for God. And then Stephen, and this is all Stephen's defense. He's giving them a history lesson. He's telling them I'm telling you the history of your people and the history of what you have turned into a mockery. And he's telling them all this leads up to Jesus. And how David found favor in God, how Solomon built a house for God. And then Stephen turns negative towards the religious leaders. He flips it on them. He tells them that they killed all the prophets, and then he turns negative on them, and they get angry. So we're going to continue with that next week. We're going to be in with verse 17. So I hope you enjoyed our study in Acts so far. And if you have not been following this, hey, go back to my playlist on my YouTube channel, Keeping It Real for Christ, Keeping It Real for Christ, and look at my Study of Acts playlist. And I've got all the way down to Acts chapter 1. So hey, I hope you enjoy this, and if you do, give me a thumbs up and tell somebody about this video, and like and subscribe, and thank you, and God bless.